Hi, everybody. It's Erin from Books with a Past. We are here with Rana Tahir, who is going to help you guys write your own choose your own adventure story. So, let me tell you a little bit about Rana, and then I will let her get to it. So, Rana Tahir is a Kundiman Fellow and a public school substitute teacher. She received her MFA, that's a Master's in Fine Arts, which is a degree that helps you learn how to be a really amazing writer, from Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon. She was born in Pakistan and raised on the beaches of Kuwait. Rana's poetry and prose has been published in various literary magazines and publications, such as Catch, The Interlochen Review, and Fresh Literary Magazine. So she really knows what she's talking about. She is excited to return to Portland with her husband and hopes to be joined by a cat soon. And I think I speak for all of us when we say we are also hoping that you are joined by a cat soon.
Thank you.
We know a lot about cats over here. We're big fans. When she is not at her desk preparing lesson plans, writing, or researching, she can be found jumping into lakes and rivers during long hikes, even though she always forgets a bathing suit and must sit in the car in her cold, wet clothes on the ride home. I have done that. It is not fun. She's a Cancer sun and moon sign, so she never regrets being in the water. All right, so now that we know a little bit about you, I'm going to turn this over to you, and you can tell us all how to write a Choose Your Own Adventure story.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us and viewing. As we go through the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to share them in the chat box, and then we will go over them at the end. In the meantime, if you're interested in writing your own Choose Your Own Adventure book, this presentation is designed to help you with the sort of beginning blocks of writing your own book. So if you'd like, please grab a paper and a pencil to write with, and we will begin. Okay, so writing up a Choose Your Own Adventure story starts pretty much the same way that any other story would, right? We're thinking of our 4 basic building blocks of a story. So the 4 main elements are, number 1, characters, so who's in your story. Number 2, the setting, where does the story take place and when. Number 3, conflict, so what's the problem going on in your story, or what is causing your character to act. And number 4 is the resolution, right? What is the ending of your story? Does it end happily? Does it end sadly? What's going on, right? Now, with a Choose Your Own Adventure story, we still use the 3 first main elements of thinking up a story: character, setting, and conflict. But we don't actually focus on the ending because there are so many endings in a Choose Your Own Adventure story. So instead, what we want to focus on is that first choice. Now on the side here, you can see I have a piece of paper that's sectioned off into 4 blocks. The first one is characters, the second one is setting, then there's conflict or problem, and then the last one is your first choice, right? The thing that makes a Choose Your Own Adventure book different from a regular novel. Now, if you'd like to follow along, feel free to divide up your paper, because we're going to go through each of these sections and hopefully you can brainstorm some ideas. And then I'll talk a little bit about, after you've outlined your ideas, what comes next. Okay, or brainstormed your ideas. Outlining is what comes next. So let's talk about characters. Who are you, right? So in terms of a character, right, with any fiction, you could be anyone that you want. Now, with my book, which you can see pictured here, and I'm also holding up here, Choose Your Own Adventure Spies, Noir Khan. Noir Khan was a real person, right? She would count as, in the list of examples, a famous person from history. So in order to write her character, I had the benefit of basically doing a lot of research. Because she was a real person, I could read about her. I could find out what made, a difference in her life, what she cared about, what was important to her, and how she acted, like things that actually happened in her life. So that gave me a lot of information that I could use in my story. But you don't have to use a famous person from history. You could write about anyone you want, right? So on this list, I have like a deep sea diver in search of Atlantis. You can see the book cover for Journey Under the Sea, which is a Choose Your Own Adventure classic, right? A mountain climber, right? The Abominable Snowman is another Choose Your Own Adventure classic, right? You could be a ninja, a doctor, you could be yourself. So if you're a kid from somewhere in the world, you could just write about a kid from where you are. Or you could write, if you're an adult, about your life and your struggles through the lens of a Choose Your Own Adventure book, right? But as you're thinking about who this character is, I want you to jot down some bullet points about what is important to this character, because that's the most important thing about any character in any fiction. You really want to focus on what's important to them, because that's the thing that's going to motivate them. That's the thing that they're going to weigh when they're trying to look at their options, right? And so that's really important to coming up with choices in your Choose Your Own Adventure book. So I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to divide your paper up if you haven't already. Remember, it's 4 boxes. And then put some bullet point notes about your character, right? Maybe even include some things like favorites of theirs, or where they're living right now and where they plan to go, right? What is their passion? So go ahead and jot down some bullet points. And I will say, stay here a little awkwardly in the silence. And if you have ideas that you'd love to share, feel free to put them in the chat, and I can share them with the group if you'd like. So a couple of things about Noir while we're sort of wrapping up this section. As I said before, Noir is a real person, or was a real person. She was an SOE spy, essentially, for the British during World War II. She was stationed in France, where she grew up, and was basically doing some really dangerous work trying to gather intelligence and sabotage supplies for the Nazis. From the Nazis, sorry, for the British. And one of the things that I found out about her before she ever joined the war effort was what motivated her. It was very clear as I read more about her and I watched a documentary about her, that the things that were important to her were always steadfast through her life. And so it made sense that she ended up choosing to join the war effort when most women were not expected to, especially a woman of her background, where she could easily just sort of ignore what was happening if she wanted to. But Noor really cared about 2 important things in her life. The first thing that she cared about very much was taught to her by her father. Her father was a Sufi Muslim, and so was she. And she was taught nonviolence and to be a pacifist. So she really, really did not believe in violence. She really believed in taking a peaceful resolution to any issue. But then the other thing that she also cared about was justice, and that good will be done, right? In her case, though, in her life, when the Nazis invade France, she is pushed out of her home, right? She has to flee for her life, like many people did. And then she has to make a choice. Well, do I continue with my pacifist beliefs, or do I try to do something about this great injustice in the world? And to her, the only thing that she could do, or that she felt she could do, was to join the war effort. Now, war is inherently, right, violent. It's a violent enterprise. So, of course, those 2 things are going to conflict, and you can see how that creates like some really juicy choices for the story. So I want you to really think about what your character cares about and how it might conflict with other things they care about. But we'll get to that when we get to conflict and the first choice, because those 2 things go hand in hand. All right, so hopefully you've jotted down some ideas. We're going to go on to the next section. So where are you? And I never say this well, but I'm just going to say it. When are you, right? So where does the story take place and when does it take place? So for example, with setting, if you are making up a character, your setting can be anywhere you choose, right? Whatever fits your character circumstance or what they're going to do, right? For example, going back to the Abominable Snowman, if your character is a mountain climber, then you'll want to be somewhere where there are mountains. And you can pick any mountain range in the world, or you can make up a mountain range that's on a different planet, depending on what time you're in. right? So maybe you're far in the future and humans have traveled off into space and colonized different uninhabited planets, right? Think Star Trek, think Star Wars, think any Asimov, right? Maybe that's your world that you want to work in. So the sky's the limit. Anything can happen because it's made up, which is the fun thing about making things up. But let's say that you're writing something about a real person, like I did with Noir. Then, of course, the settings are mostly given to you, right? In Noir's case, she was actually in Paris. She did actually go to Falmouth in the UK. She went around in different parts of France as she was spying on the Nazis. But it's also fiction. So one of the things about writing a choose your own adventure book that's based on a real person is you can't stick to the biography too much because the point is to make choices. In a biography, choices have already been made by the character or by the person. So some alternatives were like, what could be something that Noir could have done, right? So in my case, I thought Noor could have gone to India because her father was Indian. Maybe she could have, in my drafts, I had an idea that she went to the United States because her mother was American. Or she just stayed in the UK, right? There were all these different avenues that she could go. And that gave me some settings. And then obviously the time period was given to me because this was late 1930s, early to mid 1940s, right? So that's the time period that I was working in. Now, if you're going to use the past, the really important thing is to do research. If you're using a real place, you should also do some research about that place. So when I was writing my book, I researched, I've never been to Paris, France. I would love to go one day. But I researched some monuments or places or even street names in Paris that I could use. I did a Google Zoom on Noir's old neighborhood and tried to match it with like pictures from history books, just to get a feel for the place so that when I was writing about it, it felt real. There is one place in the book that I actually have been to, and that's Lahore, Pakistan, because that's where my family is from. So I've been there a lot. So I included that in the book in her India journey because I knew I could write about it in a way that felt real because I knew that place. So that's the benefit of writing about a place that you know. But if you don't know the place, just take the added time to do some research so that it comes alive for your reader. Then in terms of time period, definitely want to do some research because if it's in the past, there are a lot of things that exist now, like say smartphones that did not exist back then, right? So one fun example is in one of the choices when you go to India, and I'm going to hold up this image right here, that's from the book. I love the illustrations. But basically when you go to India, I wanted to have the captain of the ship that you take come up over the loudspeaker and basically say that, you know, they're arriving now. But when I wrote that into the draft and our fact checkers looked at it, they came back and my editor came back and said, I don't think loudspeakers existed on ships back then. Turns out they didn't. So I had to rewrite that section just because one tiny detail did not fit the past. So definitely do your research. But take a few moments now to sort of jot down some things about where you are and when does the story take place. And also maybe think about what are some interesting things going on in the world or in your made up place that might be important to your character, that might be an interesting backdrop for you to use. We'll go for a few more minutes of writing. I feel like I should make that, you know, what was it? Jeopardy music, you know, doo, 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 doo. That'd be funny for me, but I can't see your reactions, so it might not be funny for you. Okay, about one more minute and then we'll move on. And of course, feel free to type in any questions or share what your ideas are or what you're working on in the comments if you choose. Okay, here we go. Okay, so before we get into our last two boxes, which are conflict or your problem, and then the first choice, let's talk a little bit about the actual writing of a choose your own adventure book. So there are two things I want to talk about in terms of writing it. The first one is point of view. Now, just a refresher, right? Point of view is basically who is telling the story and who are they telling it to. So first person point of view is I am telling the story about myself, right? So I'm going to use I, me, my, we, us, our words and sentences, right? That's one of the more common ones in fiction. Another really common one is third person. So you can see I'm jumping down, which is she, her, he, his, they, their, right? I'm telling the story about someone else who's not a part of the conversation, right? So third person and first person you see often in fiction, but in choose your own adventure books, what you're writing with is second person, right? I'm telling the story about or to you, the reader, directly. And this is important for choose your own adventure stories because it basically makes the reader feel like they are the character and that they do make the choices as they go along, which you do. So you really want to emphasize that with using second person. Now, second person can be hard to write in for people who don't write in it very often, and I don't. Before this book, I actually have never really ever written in second person. So my method and what I would suggest to you is I just wrote the book in the way that was easiest for me. So I wrote it in third person, which is what I use most often. And then I went back and changed it to second person. I'm a firm believer in not making things more complicated than they need to be. So my suggestion to you is as you're writing, write in whatever's comfortable for you, and then go ahead and change it as you go through to revise because like any writer knows, you're going to have to revise anyway. It's a very important, if not the most important part of the writing process. Okay, so that's point of view. Quick refresher on that. And then the other thing is passive versus active voice, right? So passive voice is basically when the definition on there says the verb that shows the subject is undergoing the action, but basically it feels like the person doing the action isn't actually taking initiative. It's more like the action is happening to them. Right now, the benefits of this is that rhythmically it can help. It can make also your writing sound more introspective. It can also slow down your writing if you want to play with time in your writing. So for example, I have Jane was running. Now, the way I like to think about passive voice is I have the subject and the action, but there's something in between sort of cushioning it. And that to me is how I think of passive voice. Right now, active voice is the opposite of that, right? It shows that the subject is taking action. That means the subject, the person doing the action, is immediately doing it, and it feels like they have agency and they've made that deliberate choice. Now, the benefit is it creates a sense of urgency, right? It makes things feel like a action scene in a movie. So, for example, Jane ran, and the way I like to think about it in my head is you have the subject again and the verb, and there's nothing in between it, right? It's the exact word that you need to describe what is happening. There's no cushion. So neither one is better than the other in general, holistically. I definitely write a lot in passive voice when I'm looking at my poetry. And then when I'm looking at fiction, I use more active voice. So it really just depends on what you want to do with your writing. So again, passive voice, if you want to slow down time, if you want to make your writing sound more introspective, like you're thinking, if you want to play with rhythm, passive voice is great for those things. But if you're in an action scene and you want things to be fast and dynamic and really punchy, then you definitely want to use active voice. So I have an example here just with the verbs highlighted so you can see a difference. Now this is from page 74 of the book, or 75 is the illustration. I'm just going to hold that up there. Now, in the book, it's written in active voice, but for this example, I just went back and sort of changed some of the verbs where I thought it still sounded or made sense into passive voice. So I'm going to read the passive voice first. We are under attack, you hear someone yell. A troop of Nazi soldiers are bursting through the back door. Fall back, Emil yells. He is pushing you back. Run, Noir, take your radio and run. Screams and gunshots are all around you. As you round the corner, you are running headfirst into a Nazi. You slap him with your radio case, and he is knocked against the wall. So as you heard as I was reading it, or maybe if you were reading it out loud to yourself as we were going along, you could feel like there are a lot of words in your mouth in those verbs, right? Are bursting, is pushing, are running, is knocked. Again, you have the verb, the action, but you have like this cushion that's sort of tied to it. Again, how I think of passive voice. Here it is in active voice. We're under attack, you hear someone yell. A troop of Nazi soldiers burst through the back door. Fall back, Emil yells. He pushes you back. Run, Noir, take your radio and run. Screams and gunshots are all around you. As you round the corner, you run headfirst into a Nazi. You slap him with your radio case, knocking him against the wall. So again, you can hear that it's a little more direct. Action feels a lot more fast-paced, right? And you can clearly picture what is happening. And of course, there's that lovely illustration in the book that also helps with that. All right, so that's all I want to say about passive or active voice. Just make sure that you're conscious of what you're choosing in any given moment and what fits that moment. Okay, so let's get to our last two boxes. Right, so the third box is your conflict or your problem. And as I said before, you really want your conflict or problem to center around the things that your character cares about. Now, in Noir's case, right, the central conflict or problem throughout the book, not just in the first choice, but in many choices after that, is will I do violence to fight for what I believe in, or will I stick to my pacifist belief, which is also something that is equally important to me, right? And this is something that Noir struggled with in her real life. When I was doing research about her, I noticed that, or not I noticed, but I learned that as she was going through her training to become a spy, for instance, in one of her final tests, she would not even pretend to injure or kill her opponent in training, right? That was how strongly she believed in nonviolence. And many of her superior officers sort of down-talked to her about that and wrote scathing reviews basically about her because of that belief. But she was very open about it. She was very straightforward. She said, this is who I am. This is what I believe, and I'm not going to compromise that. Right now, in an action, this was in training, right? This is before she's actually been in a battlefield or been in a situation that was really dangerous to her. So I wanted to play with that in the book. Throughout, especially the Europe storyline, she is put in dangerous situation after dangerous situation, and she has to choose because there's a way out if she chooses violence, but there may be a harder way out if she chooses to stick to her pacifist beliefs. So that was a big thing that I kept pushing whenever I got the opportunity to. Obviously, there are other conflicts as well, but that was like the main thing that I had going into the book. So I want you to think about what your character cares about that you jotted down before. And I want you to think of ways that these things that your character cares about could come into conflict with each other. And that is your central problem. So here we have some examples on the screen. So I'm going to read the first one. Right, you have traveled all the way to Kathmandu, Nepal in hopes of finding some trace of Yeti. When you arrive, your friend and climbing partner Carlos is nowhere to be found. That's basically the problem, right? You're here, you want to find a Yeti, that's important to you, right? You're here on this vacation and you have a mission to achieve, but you also care about your friend, right? And you're worried for your friend. So those are two things that you care about. And you can see how they're in conflict with each other because of the situation, right? Normally, going to a mountain doesn't necessarily conflict with your friends, but in this case, it does because your friend has gone missing, and that might take away some time from your actual mission. It can put you in danger, right? There are a lot of factors to consider. Right, now you can see how this will lead directly into the first choice. The first choice is, should you head out in the dangerous snowy peaks and search for him? Should you search for your friend, or should you continue with your mission, or maybe even stay in place because it's dangerous out there, right? You can see how you're going to, as a reader and as a writer, weigh these different options and think about what would work for you in that situation, right? You can choose to be safe or to continue your mission and then lose your friend, or you can choose to go after your friend and possibly lose the chance at finding the Yeti, or even just putting yourself in danger. Both of these choices are equally valid, And that is really important to the first choice. But before we talk about that first choice, I want you to take some time to jot down some ideas for your conflict or your problem. What is the big thing that starts the book? You may have better and bigger conflicts as you go through, but you want that little snowball effect. What is the first choice that's going to happen that sets the story in motion? And that comes from your first conflict. What is your conflict? So go ahead and jot down some ideas for your conflict. I will wait here and play the Jeopardy music in my head. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use the chat. Okay, hopefully everyone's jotted down a few things. So let's talk about how this conflict feeds into the first choice and some important things to know about your first choice. So your first choice has to be a tough choice. In fact, all of your choices should be choices with meaning. What I mean is, you can see the note on the slide there that says the difference between a which way choice and creating one with meaning, right? A which way choice would be something like go left or right, or are you going to go through this cave or go up that hill, right? Which way choices, unless there's something specific that has been mentioned about each of these choices, they don't usually mean very much. It's arbitrary. Anyone can choose any side for any reason, and it doesn't weigh heavily on the reader or on the writer. A choice with meaning is one that, you actually have to sit there and consider and weigh your options. Now, you can think about your own life, right? The choices that have meant the most to you in your own life have probably been the ones with more meaning behind them. And those are the choices you probably spent more time thinking about and worrying over than, say, what to have for breakfast. Although that could be a tough choice too, depending on the circumstances of the person making the choice. But in those cases, right, you really sit with and wrestle with your options. And you want your reader to do the same thing in the book. If you as a writer are not wrestling with those options yourself, your reader's probably not going to either. So definitely think about the why behind your choices. Why is this option important and hard to choose? What do you get from it? What do you lose? Why is this other option important or hard to choose? Again, what do you get from this choice and what do you lose? Because holding all things equal, you want to be able to get something from each of the choices and you want to be able to lose something. Stories aren't interesting if nothing bad happens to your characters, or if nothing potentially bad could happen to your characters in a case of choose your own adventure, because the reader doesn't know what happens until they make the choice. That's one of the fun things about it. So in terms of your first choice, then, you've already thought of your conflict. Now you want to set up that choice. The conflict is driven by something that is really important to your character, and then you just want to state it for your reader. Okay, here's what you care about, here's what's going on, and here are your options. The fun thing about making choices is that it's very intuitive. Once you've gotten your first choice, and this was true for me, and I feel like other choose your own adventure writers that I've spoken to, it seemed to be true for them as well, although I'm not going to put words into anyone else's mouth. But once you came up with your first choice, it again is like that snowball effect, and you start coming up with choice after scenario after result, right? And it's very intuitive, and you keep going until you hit what feels like a natural end. Or you could be like me and just refuse to end anything until, the editor says, hey, there's a page count limit. We can't go forever. So that, that's a good way to stop is, I have a page limit. Better stop here. But it's really fun coming up with choices. It's really fun coming up with what happens after each choice, right? So as you're writing your choice, your first choice, jot down also what you think will happen after in the immediate aftermath. So for example, with Noir, the first choice is Noir has just heard on the radio that the Nazis have invaded France and that they're probably going to take Paris very soon. And she has to leave with her family. So she and her brother, Vilayat, are listening to the radio broadcast and they're discussing, okay, what are we going to do? Now, Vilayat has this idea that he wants to go to the UK with their family so that they can stay somewhere closer to their home and they can hear news of what's going on. And that's what Vilayat's going to do. So Noor loves her family. She really cares about them. And she considers that option. Okay, I could just go to the UK with my family and we'd be close to home. We'd be able to hear about what's happening. And if we choose, we could probably do something about it. Obviously, in Noor's real life, this is the choice that she makes. So then I was thinking, well, what is the other thing that she could choose? And this idea was given to me by my editor, which is where else could she go, right? And my editor thought of India. And Noor was very proud of her Indian heritage. She had actually written a book and published it. She was a children's author before she became a spy. And she wrote a book basically about tales from India, but in in a European language so that Europeans could read about these tales from her childhood. So in the book, I had her sort of accidentally bump into a copy of her book and look at it and get the idea, well, what if I went to India to look up our extended family and maybe a friend or two, right? So these are the two things that she's weighing. Obviously, in the context of the book, also, it's very clear that she cares about her father, who at this time has already passed away. And so going to India is also a way to sort of connect with his memory. So both of these things are important. She could go with her living family, or she could go and try and reconnect with her old family, or not old family, but her father who has passed away. But she's also losing something, right? In both, she's gaining something, but in both, she's losing. So in the UK, she goes with her family. She sort of loses the opportunity to go on this adventure to India, which, as she grew up in Europe, it was unclear how much time she spent in India. And from what I could gather, I don't think she spent any time. So it would have been a completely new experience for her. Or she could go on this adventure in India, but then she would not be with her family. And she cherishes and cares about her family a lot. In fact, at the time, she was helping support her family. So that was the first choice. Now, obviously, in the European side, when I was thinking ahead, it was very clear that she's going to get the opportunity to maybe choose to go into the war effort. But then I had to think of, well, what would she do if she didn't want to go into the war effort? And I thought, well, maybe she'd continue being a writer since that's what she cared about as well. On the India storyline, I made up a friend that she could go look up. And then as she goes there, she sees sort of a protest for the Indian independence movement. And she could choose to possibly do that because she was very vocal in her life about her support for Indian independence, just like her father was very supportive of it. So that was my first choice. And that was me sort of thinking ahead to what could the next few choices be. All right. So I want you to jot down, or hopefully you've already been jotting down, your ideas for your first choice, and then what could possibly come after. And that's a good way to structure it. What is the choice? What happens next? Right? So here's my choice. Here's option A. Here's what happens in option A. Here's option B. Here's what happens in option B. And then you just keep going from there until you have this big outline of choices. So I'm going to stop for a minute. I've been talking a lot. And give a couple of minutes to finish jotting down some things in that last box for your first choice, and then we'll talk about the aftermath, what comes next now that you have this blueprint. And again, any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat and we can get to them. Okay, hopefully that's given everyone a little bit of time. We're going to go on to the next part. And so you have your character, your setting, your conflict, and then your first choice. Now, where do you go from there? Well, the next step is to really go through and outline your story. So just start writing, like I said before, here's a choice. What happens next if you choose this option? And what happens next if you choose that option? And then you can go what I'm going to call horizontally, right? You could just write through each choice and aftermath on the same level and then go further down, or you can just go through one whole branch, right? Here's my first choice. I chose option A. Here's another choice. I chose option A from that choice again, and then go down until you hit a natural end. However you want to do it, but you really want to just map out all of the choices in your story. And here on the screen, what you can see is an example of my outline from my book. And it's color-coded. The color coding doesn't actually matter. It was for me to sort of keep track of what pages I was writing each day. But basically, I went through and I outlined, okay, here's one thread, or what I called a timeline of my story from the first choice all the way to an ending or a loop. And then here's the next one. I just kept mapping those out just so I could see my story and I knew what to write and what was connected to anything else, especially with loops. With loops, you want to make sure you're consistent on every storyline that is connected to your loop. So once you have your outline done, then what you would want to do is you want to actually start writing out each set of pages in your story. If you want help with that, or if you want something to help you write your story, there is, of course, that Google slide presentation that is shared with you. You can copy that slide and make your own copy so that you can start writing in it. And you'll notice one of the cool things about it is it gives you a space to write the page, and then it gives you at the bottom, like, okay, go to this page or go to the next page. So it'll already scramble things for you. If you want help scrambling, what I did, which actually I didn't need to because my editor was going to take care of this scrambling the pages so that things weren't, linear in a row. But what I did was I actually just put either the choices or the page numbers, because at that point I'd written the pages out on little slips of paper and then just like kind of fluffed them up and like picked at random, and that was my order for pages. And so that helped scramble it. And then, of course, if something coincidentally happened to align, like here's the choice and here's the option, I would just move it elsewhere. So that's a possibility. But you have all your choices, you've mapped it out, you see where all your endings are, and then you just start writing each individual page like you would in any book. And then that's it. Then you just go back and revise. Especially if you wrote in first or third person, you'll definitely want to go back and change it to second person. Or if you wrote in passive voice because that's easier, you might want to go back and change things to active voice, things like that. And then you're done. You've got it. You have created your own Choose Your Own Adventure book. So hopefully at this point, we have time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to use that chat box and we'll get to them. Or any comments if you want to share what you're working on. I hope that you continue with your writing and that you really enjoy the process, because it is a lot of fun. And I think the lessons that I learned in writing this book, I'm definitely going to take to my own, traditional fiction. But thank you so much.
Well, I've got a question.
Sure.
Are you, if you were to write another Choose Your Own Adventure, what do you think your next topic would be?
I'm working on research right now for another Choose Your Own Adventure book. It's something I want to pitch to my editor eventually, but I loved working on Noir's story for a lot of reasons, and also writing about World War II. I'm a huge history buff, and so is my husband. He's actually a historian. That's what he studied. And he specialized in World War II, which was really, really helpful for me. But I absolutely love history, and I feel like Choose Your Own Adventure books are a great way to sort of bring history to life. So I definitely want to do another one of these. And the other thing that I really loved about writing about Noir was I felt very much connected to her personally. I like to joke that we kind of look alike on the cover. I can't find the picture, but I have a picture where I look just like this. My hair was very short, so it has that shape and everything. But the things that I really resonated with her was she is of Indian descent, like I am. She's a Muslim, like I am. She is what we would call today a third culture kid, basically, where she is from two very different cultures, or not very different, but two different cultures. And she grew up in a third, so in France, or she was born in Moscow. So for those, and for me, that was true. In my bio, you mentioned that my family's from Pakistan. I was born there, but I grew up in Kuwait, and now I live in the United States. So I felt a kinship to her in that sense. And I'd really like to replicate that. So the next idea that I'm thinking of and that I'm researching for is set in World War I. And it centers around the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So for anyone who knows what that is, you know that it's the agreement that basically cut up the Middle East and created sort of the stage of the modern Middle East that we see today. So I really want to do a spy book around a figure from there. A lot of the more famous figures, I don't want to be the central character, so I'm trying to find sort of a minor figure who would also fit sort of that spy theme. So that's what I'm working on.
So when you wrote this one, and you may have said this and I just missed it, when you wrote this one, did you write like one story all the way through, or did you jump back and forth between the different options?
So I outlined sort of horizontally, like you said, going through the different options. But when I wrote them all the way through, which is why I had that slide with like my outline mapped out, because it helped me sort of keep consistent. And then once I had those, what I call root pages, written out, I could use them for any other branching off.
Very cool. And then my last question, and if we have any, this is the last call for questions in the comments. But my last question is, if we had some people who wanted to write a choose your own adventure as a group, how do you think that would work? Like if you wanted to write it with a friend, let's say.
Oh, that would be interesting. I would say probably the most collaborative part would be the outlining and the brainstorming, right, where you're coming up with the choices together. And then in terms of writing, like maybe divide up who's writing what pages or who's writing what storyline. And then obviously go over it at the end to make sure the language and everything is consistent. But that would be challenging, but really fun. Or you could have each person take a choice. That would be cool. Where like, because if you think about choices, they're like in comic books, you have different timelines, right? Where worlds are very different. You have like Superman, and then you have Soviet Superman in one of the comics. So it'd be interesting to actually divide it up by timeline, and say like, okay, I'm going to write all of these timelines so that the language is different, and and the other person's going to write these timelines so that the language again is different. And that would be fun. I think it would be challenging.
So like in an example using your book, like one person could write this setting in India, and one person could write the setting in Paris or in France.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think that would be fun. So if we have any watchers who want to try that, let me know. I think it would be fun to like set up a little group choose your own adventure workshop, and that's something we could totally do over Zoom too, or over YouTube or something. So
yeah, that would be so fun.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
In the comments, I posted a link to the Google Slides so that you can do your own outline of a choose your own adventure. Just copy that slide and you can write it. You probably want to print it out and write it by hand. And then I also have a PDF version of that. If anybody would like a PDF, just contact me and I can send it to you. All right. Well, Rana, thank you again so much for your time. Hopefully this has been good for you. It's been great for us. I apologize for my office/storage room behind me, by the way. But yeah, so we really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you have good luck in your writing.
All right. Thanks, guys.